Hey, dear Black Austin Democrats, I'm Brian Register. I've got a little organization I want to tell you all about real quick. I'm hoping that y'all can give us a hand. So I started this just after Charlottesville, which, if you'll recall, was a race riot built around celebration of a Confederate icon. So there was a Robert E. Lee statue that was really central to that event. So these statues and monuments have been around for a really long time. They're actually a serious issue. They're not just a blight on the landscape. They have an effect on the present. So I want to get rid of some of these things. My basic argument here is that if you honor someone for doing something, then you're saying that it was good. So if you honor someone for their Confederate service, then you're saying that that service was good. And so if it was actually bad, then you're lying. So there's kind of three ways in which the monuments can conceal history. There's three kind of facts that they could be possibly concealing. It could be that it could be that the Confederacy was not bad because slavery was not bad. So a lot of people will say, oh, slaves were content. And of course, as we all know, that's a complete lie. Some people will say, well, okay, slavery might have been terrible, but it really didn't have too much to do with the Civil War. That the Civil War was fought over basically anything else, states' rights or taxes or something like that. This is also a lie. And partly that issue gets confused because people want to talk about the cause of the Civil War. The Civil War wasn't an individual human action. I mean, nobody civil warred. The South had a motivation for seceding. The North had a motivation for preventing the secession. The Southern states very clearly seceded for the one sole and exclusive purpose of retaining slavery. They were really explicit about it. You can take 10 minutes, read the Southern secession documents, and you're in no doubt about it at all. And the other kind of lie that people can tell, I mean, they might say, sure, slavery was terrible by our standards and the secession was terrible by our standards, but we shouldn't judge the past by our standards. We should only judge the past by their standards, which is moral relativism. And I am professionally an ethicist, and I will tell you that moral relativism is an excuse for doing bad moral thinking. It's something that is incompatible with the American way of life. It has got to be kind of stamped out. So when people get in arguments about these monuments, they will often resort to moral relativism, which means basically that might makes right. We can't be having that. The other kind of big argument for getting rid of these things is that they conceal our history, right? So again, if you're honoring someone for doing something and it was bad, you're concealing the badness. And you might think, well, why does that matter? I mean, I don't know most of history. Why is this part of history that I kind of need to know? And here's kind of the reason. Present racial injustice is better concealed than past racial injustice. Right? So once upon a time there was slavery, which is extremely explicit, and then there was Jim Crow, which was extremely explicit, and now we've got the school to prison pipeline, right? And it's like this is a whole bunch of individual actions by individual, slightly racist, mostly well-intended teachers, and then we've got policing disparities, and it's not like your usual cop wakes up in the morning and thinks, I want to arrest black and white people at different levels for the same crime. Right, but it's there anyway, and we've got disparate sentencing, and the jury does not think, I definitely want to put a black guy away in jail for a really long time, but not a white. Nobody thinks that. And then mass incarceration, which looks like it's law enforcement, even though, in fact, it's institutionalized white supremacy. So what we've got nowadays for white supremacy is harder to see. It is actually objectively harder to see. So if you can't tell that slavery was institutionalized white supremacy, you definitely cannot tell that school to prison pipeline mass incarceration is white supremacy. And moreover, present racial injustice might cost us something to deal with. I mean, we're going to need to change policies. There are institutions that will actually have to change. There will have to be money spent. You don't have to do anything to acknowledge that slavery was essential to white culture and the white economy before the Civil War. It costs me nothing to know that. That's an historical fact. If I can't acknowledge the institutional white supremacy from 150 years ago, when it costs me nothing to do so, I am definitely not going to be able to recognize it in the present, where I might actually have to do something about it. So these monuments conceal our history, and they thereby conceal our present. I'm not saying this is the most important issue in the world, but it is an important and relevant issue. So my conclusion is nothing honoring the Confederacy may stand. Actual historical documentation does not honor the Confederacy. If somebody starts coming after battlefields, I'm going to be really upset with them. But anything that honors the Confederacy is no good. So we've been trying to take this on in different fronts because there's a whole lot of Confederate stuff around. In the Austin Independent School District, there were 5 schools named after Confederate figures. 2 of those have been changed. The 3 that remain are Reagan High School, Lanier High School, and the Johnston campus. So we've been working on trying to get these things renamed. So Reagan was the Postmaster General of the Confederacy and otherwise not a particularly interesting person. He partly wrote the Declaration of the Causes of Secession of Texas. Sidney Lanier was a poet, and he was mostly a post-war poet, and he's not, to my mind, a terrible poet, but he's also not a particularly important one. And there's certainly nothing that would make it so that Austin should name a school after him in the 1960s, and likewise with Johnston. So these 3 schools were named after people who are notable either mostly or exclusively for their attachments to plantation society or the Confederacy. They were named that during the period of so-called school integration in Austin, which never really worked, right? And the way that it worked, that it was supposed to work, was black students could go to any school they wanted. And it's pretty obvious there, if you've got to let the black students come into your school, but you really don't want to, just put a big, Confederate battle flag in front of it, and they will know to go somewhere else. It's a terroristic threat. In Austin, not the school district, but the city, there's 4, so you know that Davis and Lee were gotten rid of about a year ago, but there's Dixie Plantation Confederate and Fort Sumter roads, and those are absurd. Those are also obviously really easy to fix. Battle Hymn, Emancipation, Union, and Appomattox. There's a bunch of other streets that are named after people associated with the Confederacy or slavery. None of those maybe are quite so obvious, and we should go through each one of them seriously considering and having a broader conversation with the people who live on the street and all the so-called stakeholders to figure out the history of these people and whether it's worthwhile to change these specific names. We've got a Jefferson Davis highway marker down south. So back in the 20s and 30s, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which put up most of these monuments, tried to basically have a Jefferson Davis highway network that would go from Richmond to, I think, LA. And it didn't really go all that far, but there's just these monuments along snippets of road that were supposed to be this highway. We've got one of those down there. They were really excited about celebrating Jefferson Davis all across the South. That shouldn't really exist. And then we've also got the Sons of Confederate Veterans like to march in some of our parades, and they have every right to reserve the street at their own expense and have a parade. That the First Amendment absolutely protects that, but they're city-managed parades where the city waives fees for a private organization to have a parade. The Sons of Confederate Veterans march in those. Those parades are subsidized by us. We should not be subsidizing the celebration of white supremacy and treason against our country. So we want to, have it so that the city council adopts a resolution saying that they will not waive fees for parades that have Confederates or Nazis or Barbary pirates in them. So those are kind of the city level things. At the Capitol, there are 3 monuments that ultimately should go away, and this is not going to happen soon. But there's a monument to General Johnston. There's a monument to Terry's Texas Rangers, which was a Confederate cavalry outfit. And then there's that gigantic Confederate monument at the south gates of the Capitol with like 4 big Confederate figures. Those shouldn't be there. There's also a painting of Jefferson Davis in, I think, the Senate chambers. And there's one more thing in there that's actually a problem. There's some cannons around, and they don't matter at all. Right? So, there's some other things that have vaguely to do with the Civil War, but they don't celebrate or honor anybody. So those things are completely harmless. And in the legislature, we have some work this session. So many southern states have these monument preservation bills that make it so that a local municipality or county or school can't do any of the changes that we're talking about doing. And various Republicans in our legislature have introduced bills to have that effect, so we need to stop those. Closely related, some have introduced bills trying to give the state jurisdiction over the interpretive content of museums. And they start out with the Alamo, but they accidentally or on purpose include all museums run by the state of Texas, saying that the curators and historians that work at these museums have to run their interpretive material past the legislature before they can display it. This politicizes history, and that's kind of our general big issue here, is that history should not be politicized in that way. And also, I'm sure that you've heard of the Sugarland 95, so this was from the convict leasing program, so it was part of the Jim Crow slavery by another name. They recently came across 95 unmarked graves from the victims of this system down in Sugarland. They were effectively owned by the Imperial Sugar Company. And so activists in the area think that this should be treated as sort of hallowed ground. It needs to be memorialized, monumentalized. There should be a museum there, which all seems like a really great idea to me. There's some conflict because the school district there kind of wanted to build some buildings on that site. And it looks like that's going well, but we should also have some bills passed in the legislature about this. So there's a group trying to get that Children of the Confederacy Creed plaque that's gone. They want to have a Sugarland 95 plaque put in its place. They're looking for an apology from the state, all of which is stuff that I want to be down there and pushing. Some of this is ultimately going to extend to other expressions of white supremacy because, African Americans are not the only victims of white supremacy in the United States or in Texas. So we are going to be moving, in the direction of Mexican Americans as well. So like the Texas Rangers are kind of an issue. We also try to provide support for allies in Fredericksburg and in Williamson County and Bell County and Dallas and even beyond. Even though I cannot travel to North Carolina, sometimes I can put out a call for donations or other kinds of support for people working on the same issues in many other states. But mainly, all of this is supposed to be educational. I want people to understand our racial history so that we can understand the present. So in addition to all of this kind of seemingly destructive stuff, I'm trying to have just educational events where we have scholars or activists come out and present about their research. So we've only been able to do this one time so far. We had a history picnic. It was great. I've got more kind of vaguely in the works. So we want to put those together, and we want to turn all of these changes into educational events. So, there's Tom Green Street. You don't know who Tom Green is probably, but he was one of the leaders of the Confederate expedition to conquer New Mexico. I'll bet you didn't know that there was such an expedition. So people should know more about that when they're thinking about whether that's an appropriate name for a street. So we really need help. Right, so I bring a lot of passion and enthusiasm and articulation to this, but I'm really just kind of the one guy. I need, there's about a half a dozen other members of the group who are pretty committed. They're putting forth some effort, but we really need more people to come to meetings, to make phone calls, to help me out with like logistical things and clerical things. Come to the legislature. We really need your help. So we don't have any financial or legal existence. We're basically a Facebook group. So if you can go to Facebook, look up Deconfederate Austin and join us, I would really be appreciative. I also have a Twitter account, so if you can follow that, that would also be great. Please come to the meetings that we have periodically. Please volunteer to help us out with stuff. The immediate next thing that we're doing is trying to show up to the Austin Independent School District Board of Trustees meeting next Monday to encourage the renaming of Reagan High School and to encourage them to turn this into an educational event rather than just some kind of name being shoved at them from above. And that's kind of our status quo. Please help me out. I would deeply appreciate it. And have a good rest of your meeting.